Tucker Carlson has been making the allegation that the NSA spied on him, that they actually went into his emails and they got some information about a story that he was working on. And he made a pretty big claim a couple of weeks ago saying that they may be doing this to try to take him off of the air. And as soon as he aired this piece, all of his colleagues in the media were sort of going, oh, that Tucker, he's just being ridiculous again. That's just a crazy right-winger out there. And all he is doing is just making up a bunch of stuff that's not even remotely related to reality. Well, if you have been a part of this channel, you know that what Tucker is saying here actually resembles the truth. We've talked about the government doing this previously historically when the government was sort of wiretapping or gobbling up conversations that Michael Flynn was having with the Russian ambassador Viselyak some time ago. And so we've understood this framework for some period of time. Okay, let me frame this out just briefly here. Ordinarily, if the US government is going to capture some conversations or interfere with your data, poke in your email address, listen in on your phone calls, or any of that other stuff, the general rule is they need a warrant. And so Tucker Carlson is a U.S. citizen, and so all of those protections apply to him. Now, the tricky part comes in when we're talking about conversations with foreign people, foreign intermediaries, foreign adversaries, foreign citizens, any of those things, because our U.S. Constitution doesn't apply to them, right? Their Constitution applies to them. So our intelligence communities, they will gobble up all those conversations. A U.S. citizen having a conversation with a foreigner, they'll say, well, gobble all of those up and just listen in, because that sort of gives us license to do that because it's outside of the jurisdiction of the United States. Then what ends up happening is because they want to make sure they're protecting U.S. citizens, they will do what's called masking, right? So they'll mask one side of the phone call and just listen in on the other side of the phone call. That's how they sort of get around the rules. Oh, well, we're not actually spying on any Americans at all. And we're just going to just mask the Americans. And that way we can get around the Fourth Amendment. So they've been doing that for some time. What happened in Michael Flynn's case, of course, is that the unmasking procedure, so Michael Flynn had been previously masked, but the unmasking procedure is sort of like a joke. You just kind of, I guess, press a button, send an email, fill out a form, something like that happens, but they just go, yeah, unmask, 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 you get an unmask, you get an unmask, everybody's unmasked, oh, it's Oprah. And everybody goes hog wild. And that's exactly what was happening during the Obama administration. So they create these protections like, oh, we're going to mask people up and make sure their identities are protected. And then practically on the back end, there's really no checks or balances whatsoever at all. And that's how Michael Flynn was sort of unmasked and then spread around. And that turned into a whole can of worms that we're still sort of not really sure what happened there. And it is, it's highly politicized, and it what looked like to be an entirely political prosecution, which of course is highly, highly problematic. So we know that there's precedence for this. We know that in Tucker Carlson's case, something like this could easily have happened. And I want to show you what he said previously. Okay, so this is a couple weeks ago. This is his original allegation. He says that they absolutely are spying on him specifically.
But it's not just political protesters the government is spying on. Yesterday, we heard from a whistleblower within the U.S. government who reached out to warn us that the NSA, the National Security Agency, is monitoring our electronic communications and is planning to leak them in an attempt to take this show off the air. Now, that's a shocking claim, and ordinarily we'd be skeptical of it. It's illegal for the NSA to spy on American citizens. It's a crime. It's not a third world country. Things like that should not happen in America. But unfortunately, they do happen, and in this case, they did happen. The whistleblower, who is in a position to know, repeated back to us information about a story that we are working on that could have only come directly from my texts and emails. There's no other possible source for that information, period.
So it may very well be that having a conversation with somebody who's a foreign intermediary, NSA gobbles that up, and somehow Tucker's unmasked, right? Somebody in the NSA gets a notice, hey man, we're looking at your emails right here. We're looking at this story you're working on, want to let you know about this. And so the question then becomes, well, why, how was that unmasking? How did that happen if that was in fact how this was unveiled? And, look, I know that Tucker himself has gotten a lot. He's kind of been pilloried in the media about this. Keith Olbermann, we've got a screenshot from him out there. And a lot of people on the left were making fun of him, and a lot of people on the right were as well. And I just want to, I think spying in general is a giant problem that we have here in the United States, right? I've said that a lot. I have called people like Edward Snowden and Julian Assange heroes and people who are, foisting the flag of transparency and accountability and sort of pulling the rug out from the government in certain areas where they should not be doing what they're doing, right? They're exposing this for what it is. And I don't approve of it in any way, shape, or form. I think it's a huge infringement on our own civil liberties. But it's sort of been something that we've all just sort of gotten used to, right? They just do this. And we know that they have been doing it. We know that they've done it entirely confidentially. We've talked about this with the PRISM case. We've talked about the Five Eyes alliance that is taking place between all of 5 different liberal democracies around the world, and the list goes on. There's 18 intelligence communities plus Space Force, and the list goes on. They are listening and watching everything. So many Americans have just said, well, that's okay. We don't care. Oh, we're going to put that device over there that listens to me, and that one and this one too, and then walk around with our cell phones all day. But it's just life now. You really can't escape it. So that's just how it is. The problem has always become when sort of the government is doing it against certain ideologies or against certain people, using it as a very specific tool, not as a shield to protect America, but almost as a sword to go after your political enemies. And in Tucker's case, right, he's a member of the media, and the media we've all called the Fourth Estate, right? There's sort of this organization that is supposed to hold the government accountable. We've got the government, and then we've got these watchdogs and these journalists that are supposed to be in there saying, hey, we want to know what you're doing in there, sir, madam, whatever, congressperson. We want answers on this. And largely our ineffective sort of emasculated media has very little fortitude. And so very little hard questions have been asked recently, unfortunately. So that's a problem when the government now is going after the media in particular. And remember when this was happening, when Donald Trump said, well, we're going to close the White House press briefing room, there was a meltdown in the media. Everybody was freaking out. Oh, we've never seen this type of assault on journalism and journalists. And, this is dangerous. And journalists are going to be getting, hurt and killed around the country because of this language. And they all just hyperventilated astronomically, right? I mean, the CO2 levels in the room went up about 10 points. And then now it's all been kind of like kind of silent, right? We're hearing allegations from a journalist who says the NSA was spying on my stuff. And we've got some pretty concrete evidence about that because they're repeating stories back to us that they would never have access to. And then everybody just sort of laughed at that. Going after the media is sort of now, I think, just a common part of our politics, right? Trump did this, and the media is I think highly problematic. But if you're inside the media, right? If you're a journalist, I've got a problem with the media in general. But if you're a journalist, if you're somebody who's working for the New York Times, and you say that what Trump was doing to the New York Times was problematic, but you're not standing up here and saying, well, what the Biden administration through the NSA is doing to Tucker, well, then you've got a little bit of an inconsistency there. So you might want to address that. But, largely I think that the government spying on anybody, whether it's Tucker or MSNBC or anybody, is a giant problem. And the line needs to be drawn in the sand there. When the government is investigating somebody who is also in the media, but is also on the opposition, like Tucker is, directly opposed to Joe Biden and his administration, that is highly problematic. Right now you're talking about specifically breaching civil liberties in order to go after your political opponents. And Tucker happens to be one of the most powerful in the country, of course, because of the size of his audience and because of his show. It's a great show. He does actually, I think, very good investigative journalism, whereas many other journalists do not. So they're not going to rally to his side, of course. But we now know that maybe there's some more to the story. Previously, they were saying this whole thing's a joke. Tucker's a joke. He's always been a joke. And now maybe there's a little bit more credibility here, because we're going to go from the NSA coming out here and saying, oh, no, he wasn't the target of anything, to now maybe, well, maybe we actually did get some of those communications. So we have this article from Jonathan Swan. He did a great piece over at Axios, and I want to show you a little bit more about him. So this is him. He is over on Twitter, almost 1 million followers, so he's got a big presence, and you can find him here at Jonathan V. Swan. So we'll check him out. He wrote this article over at Axios. He says, scoop, Tucker Carlson sought Putin interview at the time of the spying claim, right? So watch the story kind of shift. I'm not trying to be critical of Jonathan Swan here. It's a good article, but you can kind of watch the narrative, shift from the NSA wasn't looking at anything that Tucker was doing to, they were, but he was talking to Putin. So they had no choice because he was talking to America's enemy number one, as they've been telling us for a long time. So you can just watch that kind of shift happening right in front of your eyes. He says Tucker Carlson was talking to the U.S.-based Kremlin intermediaries about setting up an interview with Putin shortly before the Fox host accused the NSA of spying on him, says sources familiar with the conversations. He says why it matters. Those sources said that U.S. officials learned about Carlson's efforts to secure the Putin interview. Carlson learned that the government was aware of his outreach, and that's the basis of his extraordinary accusation, followed by a rare public denial by the NSA that he had been targeted. Axios has not confirmed whether any communications from Carlson have been intercepted, and if so, why, right? So we're still sort of lacking some proof here. This article is going to go through and we're going to speculate and sort of dissect some of the different possibilities that are happening here. But I want to just be clear here. We're gonna go through the article and we're gonna sort of check in, because Jonathan Swan, after this article, to his credit, I mean, he's all over Twitter, sort of trying to defend some of the misinterpretation of what he has written here. So you're going to see here that he's sort of explaining what's happening and gaming out some possibilities, but also recognizing that there's a lot of information that we don't know here. And so people who are hopping on Twitter and saying, see, we told you so, Tucker was right, or Keith Olbermann saying, see, I told you so, he was talking to America's enemies. Swan's out there on Twitter sort of batting those down. Nope, that's not accurate, that's not accurate, that's not accurate. And I'm going to show you that here in a minute. So just want to frame that out. Let's see what else is in his article. He says, let's take a look at the big picture. We talked about this previously. He said Carlson, when he made those charges, he instantly became a cause celeb on the right, which feasted on the allegation that one of America's most prominent conservatives might have been monitored by the U.S. intelligence community, right? We talked about it here, right? I was sort of roiled up about it. The backstory. So Carlson told his roughly 3 million viewers on June 28th, that clip that I already just played for you, said that we heard from a whistleblower, they're monitoring our communications, and they're planning to leak them in an attempt to take us off the air. So we played that. Carlson said his source was in a position to know, and information came from his text and his emails, said it's illegal for the NSA to spy on citizens, but we know they do happen, as we had talked about in the Michael Flynn case and others. The NSA said in a tweet the next night that his allegation is untrue. Here's what they wrote in their statement. We talked about this as well. They said that Tucker Carlson alleged that they have been, quote, monitoring our electronic communications. They say this allegation is untrue, but they refer to one allegation, singular, and he's making two right here, right? Monitoring, and then the attempt to take off his show. There's an and right here. So it's facially non-responsive. It's only responding to one combined allegation rather than addressing either of those. But I guess you can bunch them up together and say neither are true. Tucker Carlson has never been an intelligence target of the agency, which is great, which as we mentioned here, he's not saying that he was the target. He's saying we want to know, were you monitoring the communications? That's a whole separate question that this paragraph does not answer. NSA has a foreign intelligence mission. Okay, again, non-responsive, doesn't matter. We target foreign powers. Okay, so like Putin. And the NSA may target a citizen with limited exceptions without a court order, but they have to have these certain exceptions if it's explicitly authorizing the targeting. So it's like, thank you for that information, NSA. That's very nice. Thank you for sending us the policy manual, I guess, that you have over there. But how about the actual question? Are you monitoring? Did you intercept any of those conversations? Might be good to know. So that was a while back. Fox News then today gave this response to Axios. They said, we support any of our hosts pursuing interviews and stories free of government interference. So good for them. Tucker Carlson said, as I've said repeatedly, because it's true, the NSA read my emails and then leaked their contents. That's an outrage as well as illegal. So it's unclear why Carlson or his source would think this outreach could be the basis of NSA surveillance or a motive to have his show canceled. So now you can see that this journalist is actually being responsive to the claim of Tucker Carlson. And Tucker Carlson he's sort of breaking these up into two claims. Number one, of course, being that they're monitoring him. Number two being that there is a motivation to take him off of the air. And so let's just keep those two separately. We can have a pin in each one of those. One, I think, is absolutely pretty clear. The other, I think, is a little bit more speculative. And I think that even Tucker Carlson might be saying that maybe his allegation that they were trying to take him off the air is going to be more difficult to prove. And so maybe that was just sort of a little bit of an exaggeration. We'll see. It says it's unclear why he made those claims. He says journalists routinely reach out to world leaders, right, including leaders of countries that are not allied with the U.S. to request interviews. So the point here is, if Tucker is doing that, then why would that get him off the air? He says it's not unusual to reach out through unofficial intermediaries rather than through the official press offices. So if Tucker is just doing regular journalism things, then why would his attempt to reach out to Putin mean that he would be off the air, right? Kind of, no, that's just journalism. NSA doesn't care about that. Now, he says numerous American journalists have also interviewed Putin, and Chris Wallace also just did so recently in 2018. So it's not even out of the ordinary. So the point being, why would the NSA care? On Wednesday, yesterday, Carlson told Maria Bartiromo on Fox News, Fox Business, that only his executive producer knew about the communications in question and that he didn't mention it to anybody else, including his wife. But of course, the recipients of the texts and emails also knew about their content. And we don't know how widely they shared this information, right? So it kind of goes both ways. So did somebody else leak that? And you're trying to connect the chain a little bit, right? If Tucker sends this to somebody else, to his producer, and they're communicating back and forth, and then it goes to an NSA informant or somebody on the inside of the government who then is the whistleblower that communicates that back to Carlson. Well, the question is, how did the NSA person get that in the first place? How did it go from those emails to that person, unless what Swan is saying here, the recipient of the text or the email themselves communicated that back to the NSA, which kind of seems like that might be far out there. All right, enough. Let's go back to the article. He goes, let's read between the lines. The NSA's public statement didn't directly deny that any Carlson communications had been swept up by the agency. Right, not at all. They didn't say that. They just said he wasn't a target. Axios then submitted a request for a comment to the NSA on Wednesday, asking whether they would be willing to categorically deny that the NSA intercepted any of Carlson's communications in the context of monitoring somebody he was talking to in an effort to set up an interview with Putin. An NSA spokesperson declined to comment and referred Axios back to the agency's earlier carefully worded statement that we just read that didn't say anything. In other words, the NSA is denying the targeting of Carlson, but is not denying that his communications were incidentally collected, right? Incidentally. Yeah, incidentally. It's just Tucker Carlson's, right? Happens to be Tucker Carlson, probably the biggest right-wing commentator on the cable news today. Incidentally collected. Got it. All right, so what's next? Experts say there are several plausible scenarios, including legal scenarios, that could apply. So let's run through a couple of these. The first and the least likely is that the U.S. government submitted a request to the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, to monitor Carlson to protect national security. Likelihood of that, probably low. A more plausible scenario is that one of the people Carlson was talking to as an intermediary was under surveillance as a foreign agent, right? So Tucker is talking to a foreigner that doesn't have the same protections against illegal spying that American citizens do. And so he got just kind of caught up in that and then somehow was unmasked and it leaked back over to him. In that scenario, Carlson's emails or text messages could have been incidentally collected as part of monitoring, but his identity would have been masked in any intelligence reports. Okay, so once it gets drafted, it's all masked. We don't know who that person is. In order to know that the text and emails were Carlson's, a U.S. government official would likely have to request his identity be unmasked, something that's only permitted if it's necessary to understand the intelligence. So they could be, reading the transcripts and they could be listening or sort of, reading the conversation. And if they can gather what is happening and they get actionable data from that, then that's it. That's the end of it. But if they need to know what person A is and who that is in order to get context about the conversation, then you have a good basis to unmask that person because it's necessary in order to understand the intelligence. So what happens if Tucker Carlson, who's unknown right now, he's an anonymous masked person, is having a conversation saying, hey, we want to bring Putin to New York. We want to have him sit down and tell us what he thinks about the Biden administration. And you have a NSA, spook out there who's saying, oh my goodness, we have a U.S. citizen who's inviting Russia over to our country to sit down here and talk badly about the Biden administration. That might be a threat to America's security because we know just how dangerous Russia is. They've been at the forefront of every single problem that the United States has been facing for the last 100 years, according to the Democrats. So now we know that this is like a Category 5 hurricane. We got to brace for impact because Tucker Carlson or Person A at this moment is talking to somebody who might be connected to Putin. So we have to unmask this person. Oh, it's Tucker Carlson. How about that? So, everything is fine. It's all kosher, hunky-dory because you're following the rules and you're just doing the unmasking just to understand the intelligence. And so maybe they say, oh, it's Tucker Carlson. Oh, it's just a Putin interview. That's all. They just want to talk about, it's Fox News, and we don't like them anyways. But the point is, they go through that whole thing. They unmask him, and they're essentially, if it's the same procedures, more or less, as was happening with Michael Flynn, there really wasn't even much of a process at all to unmask somebody. It's just like, hey, send an email and it just happens. So we'll see if there's anything more there. There's a third scenario that Swan lays out for us. He says that interceptions might not have involved Carlson's communications. The U.S. government routinely monitors the communications of people in Putin's orbit who may have been discussing the details of Carlson's request for an interview, right? So it'd be like if Tucker, who is a U.S. citizen, sends it to a foreign intermediary, and the foreign intermediary, that conversation from Tucker to the foreigner is not being captured, but the foreigner then, who's in Russia, presumably, communicates that, let's say, to the Russian embassy, over to Russian scheduling person, to the receptionist over there at Putin's residence, and then they get the whole thing scheduled. But maybe the U.S. intelligence services, the NSA, are actually monitoring those conversations. And they say, oh, they're passing around memos about getting Putin scheduled in Tucker's studio. And so we're just monitoring that. And then the NSA person says, oh, no, we weren't listening to you. They were talking about you. That's how your name came up. It had nothing to do. We weren't looking at your stuff. It was just somebody else who was talking about you. And that's what flagged it for me. So let's go back. It says, under this scenario, though, Carlson's identity would have been masked in reports as part of his protection as a citizen. And the unmasking would only be permitted if a U.S. government official requested that his identity be unmasked. And it's not clear why that would be necessary here. Two sources familiar with Carlson, right? Because in that case, they're talking about an interview, right? They're not talking about, hacking a pipeline again. They're talking about an interview. So why would they need to unmask Tucker Carlson if it's not necessary to understand the intelligence? Because they're talking about an interview, which is obviously very common. Chris Wallace did one, and we've noted that other people have interviewed Putin before. So what's the big deal? Why would they unmask him in that third scenario? Maybe they wouldn't. The intrigue, this article wraps up, says two sources familiar with Carlson's communication said that two Kremlin intermediaries live in the United States, but the sources could not confirm whether both are American citizens or whether both were on U.S. soil at the time they talked to Carlson. So what if now they were both U.S. citizens? That kind of changes the equation a little bit, right? Now, obviously illegal. Let's see here. He says this is relevant because if one of them was a foreign national and on foreign soil, the U.S. government wouldn't necessarily have had to seek approval to monitor their communication. So if they were on foreign soil, right, not on U.S. soil. Okay, so let's see what else Jonathan Swan has to say. So he mentioned previously, right, this is the author of the article. He's sending this over there. He says, NSA spokesman declined to comment, referring them back to the original story that they incidentally collected the material. Now, Jonathan Swan was out all over Twitter. This was today, and he's kind of just bouncing around defending the article, which I think is certainly to his credit. He's saying to Keith Olbermann, remember Keith Olbermann? Haven't seen him around in a long time, but I just followed him over on Twitter because he is just hysterical to watch. As we told you at the time, he says, Tucker Carlson was communicating with a foreign-based individual intent on harming the U.S., right? So that's Keith's claim, saying that, well, that's what you get there, old Tucky Tuck. So that is something that is perfectly lawful because you were talking to Putin, and as Keith Olbermann has been screeching about for the last 25 years, Putin is what's wrong with the entire world, and he's responsible for Trump, and he ruined Hillary's life and all of this stuff. Very, very dramatic about it. So when Tucker Carlson is communicating with Putin, he's saying, well, that's what you get. NSA should be spying on you because Putin has been wrecking America for a long time. Jonathan Swan, though, he says, what, Keith? He says, that's not what the story says there, buddy boy. He says, I have tried to get foreign interviews with adversaries and use back channels when front door doesn't work, right? As a journalist. Keith is a journalist. Keith was a journalist or pretends to be a journalist, but he knows how this works. He says, I would not expect my name to be unmasked if comms involving me or about me were intercepted. We don't know yet how the U.S. government learned info, only that they did, right? So we don't know how. How did they get it? Which is the big question. And that's where some of the impropriety really might be. And Jonathan Swan is, no. Reaching out to an adversary for an interview, perfectly legal, perfectly lawful. No reason to unmask that, right? It's part of the fourth estate. It's just regular journalisming. Keith Olbermann doesn't quite get that, doesn't get much. But anyways, Jonathan Swan was out there also kind of clearing things up here with Sean Davis as well. Sean Davis says the details aren't cloudy at all. The corrupt intelligence community spied on Tucker, collected his communications, unmasked him, and then leaked his comms to reporters who are now refusing to, quote, confirm what their own government sources admitted to them. Jonathan Swan says, pushing back on this, he says, listen, if I had specific info on Tucker's communication, I would publish it. If I had info on an intel report or unmasking, I would publish it. I don't. I published everything I could confirm so far. This piece lays out different scenarios and raises questions that we are still chasing. Okay. So there's still a lot to get to there. I think that Sean Davis is probably right? If you had to speculate, probably right that they did in fact spy on him. They did collect his communications. They did unmask him, and they are now sort of using this to their advantage. Right. And that's not in evidence yet, though. We don't have that yet. Jonathan Swan is, holding the line a little bit back from everybody who wants to sort of make this into something that it's not quite yet, but it might feel like it in fact is. All right, so let's take a look at the questions over from watchingthewatchers.locals.com. Let's see what we've got going on here. We've got a couple questions now popping in here. Joe Snow says the government is never punished. Be Brave is here in the house. Want to Know says the government caught to sell a house and work somewhere else, such a hassle for them, like the Catholic Church. We've got, let's see who else is here. Want to Know says teachers are part of the government. All right. Kenny 1B, there's a question, says most likely is that the intermediary that Tucker is using is also trying to recruit intelligence assets within the U.S. government for Russia. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, yeah, wow, interesting. Joe Snow says, if the entire federal government, let's not read that one. Let's see what else. Thunder is here. Thunder 7 is here. Says, Rob, don't understand why Tucker is surprised that the NSA is spying on him. Obama and his crew spied on the Trump campaign 5 years ago. Trump was ridiculed by the fake news on a daily basis and called them the enemy of the people. Tucker experiencing just a tiny amount compared to what Trump has endured. Slings and arrows, says Thunder 9. Yeah, that is a good point, right? Donald Trump was very adversarial with the press, and I think for good reason. I think that they were not fair to him, but can you expect that really? Probably not. I have a big problem with the media. I think that they are completely one-sided, at least some of the mainstream ones that I follow, right? I for this show, I do pop around to many of the mainstream sources just to sort of keep my bearings straight. But the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times and some of the other ones that I follow, they're pretty consistently ideologically one-sided, right? It's pretty obvious if you read enough of them. So I don't know that's going to necessarily change, right? Every politician is going to complain about the media. They all do. I don't think that is even really, what I'm upset about at all. I don't really even care about that. It's the media. You're in politics. Deal with that. They're going to be one-sided. We already know that. That's just the playing field. The next, I guess, question, though, is when does that become sort of illegal, right? When does the government pushing back against the media cross that line? And if you're going to be spying on journalists, that is clearly crossing the line, in my humble opinion. All right, let's see what else we've got. We've got Jeremy Matrita here. He says, even though the government spying on U.S. citizens is the norm, but it doesn't make it any more legal. That's true, right? And we shouldn't accept that, right? It's just not something that I think we should just roll over on, which is why we're doing the show, of course. Let's see. We've got Joe Snow says, the NSA, FBI, CIA, IRS, ATF, Congress, White House, what have any of these people done for anybody lately? It's a good question. I don't really know. We got Kareem165 says, did you hear today that there will be a vaccine passport starting in September for Quebec? No, I did not hear that. I've been to Quebec. Maybe not going back there, though. Thunder 7. Okay, we got Thunder 7 already. Let's see what else we have here. We've got DK Poor here says, Rob, do you think that Congress can sort of reverse this unacceptable and illegal spying of U.S. citizens? That's a good question. I would say technically they could, right? They could unwind the jurisdiction of the FISA court. They set a lot of these policies in place, but I don't think that they would ever do that. I mean, technically, yeah, they could is that practically anything that's ever going to happen? I really don't think so. And even if they did, based on what we've seen with Prism and the Five Eyes and all of that sort of really, really undercover stuff that I think is built in at the root level, the backbone of the internet, I'm not real sure that there's really much of anything that can be done to put that genie back in the bottle, unfortunately. So privacy is obviously a big issue. And, privacy can be one of those things that people can forfeit, and that might lead them to being charged with crimes, which is a big reason why it's so important. And if you happen to know somebody who is facing criminal charges in the state of Arizona, we would love the opportunity to help. We have an amazing team of people here at our law firm, the R&R Law Group. We're quite good at what we do. We're very aggressive in court. We have fun here on the show, but when it's court time, and we need to go in there and help you achieve your goals and reach the outcome that you deserve. And so our office is ready and available to help. Our phone number is 480-787-0394. The website is rrlawaz.com. And our mission here is to provide safety, clarity, and hope to good people facing criminal charges. And we'd love the opportunity to help. If you don't need any criminal representation, very good thing. You might want some informational offerings, including the law enforcement interaction training, which of course is over here available at gumroad.com/Robert Gruler. It's a 2.5-hour course that you can get through pretty quickly. There's also a cheat sheet in there. So if you don't want to sit through 2.5 hours, you don't need to. You can listen to about the first hour and a half, and you'll have a crash course on criminal law, and you'll understand how to interface with the police. But there's also if you just want to skip all that, just go get it. There's a slide deck, 6 slides, explains the whole thing. You can read that in about 10 minutes. If you want to check that out, gumroad.com/Robert Gruler. All right.